Hello and welcome to the Dissidents podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Mike Burke and Dmitri Shufutinsky discuss his soon-to-be published book entitled Jew-jitsu, which focuses on how to push back on anti-Semitic and anti-Israel claims. Hello, welcome back. Thanks for listening or watching if you're on YouTube. I am here with Dmitri always mess up your mum's name. What is it?
Shufutinsky.
Shufutinsky. Sorry about that. Shufutinsky. It's difficult for me. I can do Japanese names like Yamanaka and things like that, but Eastern European ones I sometimes struggle a bit with. So sorry about that. I hope you don't consider that a microaggression, though I doubt you type 2.
That's okay.
All right. So we're here to discuss your book, which is coming in a few months, I understand, which has quite a cool name, Jew-jitsu. The Judaic Jew rather than the J-I-U from Japanese, which I presume is about how to fight back against what strikes me as absurd anti-Semitic claims, but apparently to the vast majority of people out there aren't absurd, which is mind-boggling, but there we are. I guess the Israel-Palestine situation, the horrors of the 7th, the change in consciousness that it's had for not just Jewish people, but a lot of non-Jews like me. I mean, I feel like I was a different person when I woke up after that happened. So good, let's start with the book. What's it about? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, so I actually started writing this book many months before October 7th. I know that a lot of people became aware of what I call in the book scholarly anti-Semitism around October the 7th or after. But really, this has been a problem for a number of years. And in the previous wars of 2014 and then again in 2021 in Gaza, I noticed that there was this growing trend on college campuses and in activist circles of trying to exclude Jews and demonize the Jewish community, or as they call us, Zionists, in coded language. So I started looking more at the history of where that comes from the extreme left, because I feel like a lot of the Jewish community is quite aware of anti-Semitism from the extreme right for obvious reasons, going back to the Holocaust. And especially in the United States, that is where a lot of the combating anti-Semitism energy goes towards, as well as in the non-Jewish community. So I started going back and looking at, where this phenomenon originated and how it is spread so widely in the United States during an era that we might, have previously thought we would have moved beyond this kind of hatred or any hatred, really. And really, it goes back to the Soviet Union, and it goes back to the Third World, what many call the Global South nowadays, in this strain of neo-Marxist language and ways of defining Jews, especially when it comes to Israel, and through language about oppression and colonialism or imperialism. So I wanted to look at what's being done by the broader Jewish community and large Jewish organizations to combat this. And I was troubled to see that very little is being done, and what is being done usually is not very effective. So I decided I need to write something about this, and I need to lay out a plan for how we can combat this spreading disease, really a social disease. What can be done, because a lot of Jewish youth are going into institutions of higher learning unprepared, unfortunately, by whether it's loved ones or whether it's Jewish day schools and synagogues they've been going to, or Jewish summer camps. Those discussions about anti-Semitism focus a lot about the Holocaust, and sort of neo-Nazi kind of groups going around, like what happened in Charlottesville in 2017. But that's, with a few exceptions, not really the kind of hate that they're facing in college campuses. And many Jewish Americans, at least, are on many issues when it comes to the environment or racial justice and the like, are quite progressive. So a lot of them are taken aback. They don't know how to deal with this, and that leads to many of them suppressing their identity, or unfortunately, in some cases, just kind of absorbing these viewpoints themselves. So in my book, I laid out, sort of 3 points for each chapter, 3 ways of dealing with this. The first is, what is a certain argument from scholarly anti-Semitism that's being used? And then, what is the history of that argument? Then I go into what is currently being done, to the degree anything is being done, to fight this. Then I go deeper into how is that perhaps not super effective, and what can we do to challenge it. So I call the book Jew-jitsu because, the martial art, you're using your opponent's power against them. So for this, I say the most effective thing is to use their arguments against them, use their very words and very arguments to sort of flip the tables. So, for example, one of the chapters is about settler colonialism and imperialism, and the argument about how, Israel is a settler colonial state. You have European Jews who moved and displaced indigenous brown Arabs, and or they're an outpost of Western empire to dominate the Middle East, so that you can go and divide up these countries and take the oil, right? So that's kind of the argument and the history of it. I go into how the Soviet propaganda in the 70s and the 80s really portrayed Israel as this vessel of American and British empire to dominate the third world, to oppress numerous poor peoples, and the use of the term Zionist to mean just Jew more broadly. So then the Jew-jitsu part of it I talk about is, let's use these arguments about indigenous peoples and colonization against them, because the Palestinians are Arab. Arabs are native to the Arabian Peninsula. They're not native to the rest of the Middle East. The Fertile Crescent, North Africa, Persia, or what is now Iran, none of these places were Muslim lands before the Arab conquest after Islam. None of these places had an Arab there. The native peoples of North Africa were either Coptic Christians who were descended from the ancient Egyptians, Black Africans, or the Berbers. In the Fertile Crescent, there were Jews, of course, in Israel who were native. There were Assyrians, there were Kurds, there were Yazidis. These are the indigenous peoples of those parts of the Middle East. So to pretend that the Palestinians are the indigenous people, when in actuality it was their ancestors who settler colonized, really from the shores of the Atlantic in Morocco all the way over to the borders of Central Asia in Iran, another country that they're not from, is ludicrous. Right. That's like saying that, just because a white farmer's family in North Dakota has lived there for 600 years, that makes that farmer a Native American. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold up to historic record or fact. So for me, what I say is, let's use the indigenous argument to say, all right, let's talk about indigenous, land acknowledgements. Are the Palestinians going to acknowledge the land that they're living on was part of the Judean Hebrew people, that they are living on colonized land? So that's an example of how I use jiu-jitsu, and there's other examples that the reader will see in the book. Unfortunately, that's not really used very much by a lot of the Jewish advocacy groups. That we see now. When they talk about this, they discuss the two-state solution, or that was sad what happened before, but we needed to talk about the Holocaust and we needed a safe haven. Some people more on the right talk about the Bible. there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of those arguments. It just doesn't address this particular claim that's being used to bash Jews on college campuses or in advocacy spaces. And it's also not exclusive of, the fact that archaeological evidence, historic record, and DNA testing all place us as the native people of that land.
Yeah, let's take the example of Gaza, right? Jews are indigenous to Gaza, right? There is archaeological evidence of synagogues, some of the kind of the mosaics and the tiling and everything that clearly identifies it as synagogues in Gaza. How many, prior to the 7th, how many Jews were there living in Gaza? None, right? And they had been forcibly moved out by Israel, right? And yet you look at Israel, okay, so they've been kicked out of Gaza, a land that they were native to, by the Palestinians, essentially. And Israel did it on behalf of the Palestinians in order to avoid something like the 7th, right? And then we look at the same question: how many Arabs are there in Israel? How many Muslims are there in Israel? None. 1%. In England, it's 2%, right? In the UK, it's 2%. 21%, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
you can't, it's an apartheid state. Okay, 2% of the population in the UK is Muslim, and nobody says the UK is an apartheid state, right? 20% of Israel, they have 2 political parties. Right. There are Arab Israelis who are heroes in the military going back to the 70s. It's just it's just a really, really, really bizarre thing. I really just don't understand why people can't see this. I mean, the gay thing as well, right? The gay thing. Queers for Palestine. What? We know what happens to gay people in Palestine, right? In Gaza. Right. Palestine never existed, but you know what I mean. Gaza and the West Bank.
Yes, this is something that even beyond the case of Israel and the Palestinians, I mean, you look at how many I don't know what you would call them, non-binary or genderqueer people describe themselves as socialists or communists. And, as somebody whose family was from the Soviet Union, these people would be either in the gulag or they would have disappeared into the forest. So that's just a huge lack of historical and political knowledge. There's no research that's being done by any of these groups. A lot of them like to use what appears to be sophisticated language in their arguments, but they have a very shallow understanding of where they would actually be or where they would stand if they were in these societies they claim to support.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if you look at, I just got into a massive row with some kind of Chinese Communist Party apologists, CCP Communist Party apologists, right, who are saying, all of these things that, the West is saying, it's all propaganda. Actually, the real thing in China is that everything's great and there's no homophobia. Come on. You have male, slightly, we don't even know if they're gay, slightly effeminate male, or slightly effeminate in the view of Xi Jinping, male pop stars that are being disappeared and banned. There is this weird, and this is another more fundamental thing. I wish people would realize that it's not really about the Jews, right? We're next. Israel is the kind of shield of the West. What is happening in Israel, they want to do in London. They want to do in the United States. And by they, I'm not meaning all Muslims. I'm meaning this hardcore of jihadis represented by groups like Hamas or Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. They want to do the same things to us. They have essentially done very similar things. 9/11 would be an example. They did similar stuff in London. Mm-hmm. I this kind of self-hatred of which, the Jews are often the target because you're perceived as being successful within the model of Western civilization. And therefore, because you're successful, the only reason that they think that you can be successful is this kind of zero-sum oppression of the people who are less well off. I'm Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this, as you just said, it goes beyond Jews and it goes beyond Israel. This is a hatred for some might call it a hatred for Western civilization. I think it's a hatred for civilization in general. I mean, you
Quite.
look at even a smaller level of this. Look what's happening in places like San Francisco or Chicago, the rampant crime, homelessness, people that are protesting in demonstration for allowing the homeless to remain in these horrific conditions, squalor, that they're sleeping in parks and public places, they're defecating in sidewalks outside of people's homes, there's needles in parks where children can play. There's a hatred of rules, and there's this breakdown of society that's being celebrated by not just jihadists, but a lot of uh, what I would say are almost neo-Bolshevik groups that want to see chaos run rampant. And so it goes to that on the smaller level. But it also crosses political lines, because if you look at the same people who are supporting Hamas or Iran, you can also look and see that many of these same people are supporting Putin's Russia or Xi
Yeah.
Jinping. Roger Waters is a great example of that, calling Biden a war criminal. We already know what he said about Israel and Jews, but buying into Putin's propaganda about Zelensky's Nazism, or saying that the situation of the Uyghurs, the genocide of them in Xinjiang, is a hoax manufactured by the West. I mean, this is a common hostility uh, towards advancement of civilization, and wanting to drag us back into almost this caveman kind of thinking, where anything goes and any rules, any society should be broken and bent.
Yeah. And it's there's this weird kind of horseshoe that I'm noticing, right? So
Yes.
for a long time, I've been aware of and fought against the woke left. I mean, I was aware of the anti-Semitism that was there way before the seventh. I knew it was a serious problem way before the seventh, but I didn't realize just how bad it was. I didn't think that we would have protests in London against Israel immediately after the seventh, before Israel had even done anything. Right? There was no Israel hadn't one soldier hadn't set foot into Gaza, right? The seventh had happened, and Israel was freaking out, thinking, "Oh, what are we going to do?" And America was trying to say, "Well, hold on, figure it out, think about it." And there were already protests in London. But what were they
Mhm.
protesting about? I mean, it was bonkers. So, I mean, there was a kind of, I knew the problem was there. I knew it was bad, but it was on another level bad. But and the horseshoe thing now. So I was aware of it on the left. I knew it was there, and I knew that there were Nazis on the right. Um, but what I'm seeing on the right is this kind of anti-Semitism seems to have crept into the MAGA lot, which is weird. Because Donald Trump in his first term was a very pro-Israel president, right? Recognizing the capital as Jerusalem and so on and so forth. Um, has Jewish people in his family, and yet now the MAGA people are kind of going pro Xi Jinping, pro Russia, pro Palestinian. What's going on there? Any ideas?
Yeah, I look at there's two examples I like to give. One where the horseshoe kind of meets. One is from the right and one is from the left. So in the case here of Israel sort of battling not just Hamas, but also the wider pro-Iranian axis, Tucker Carlson had tweeted maybe like 10 days ago or something, maybe a little longer, something along the lines of anybody who wanted to strike Iran or its proxies from within the U.S. government. This was after the 3 troops were killed in Jordan by a pro-Iranian militia.
Yeah.
And so there were calls by some Republican senators to strike harshly, including into Iran. And he labeled them as some kind of lunatics and morons. I don't want to use the exact language because it was not appropriate for this kind of public space. But he used that language. He'd also apparently dissuaded Trump from attacking Iran back in 2019 during all of those tensions in the Persian Gulf. Candace Owens is another one who has
Right.
promoted very anti-Israel kind of language that I guess you would hear it from somebody like David Duke, who is also thought of as an extreme right-wing person, but talks about Zionist lobbies and how much he admires Ilhan Omar or Louis Farrakhan, people he would supposedly hate for not being white or Christian. So that's one example, and there are many others in this sort of MAGA crowd who are very isolationist, and as this country has seen and some others, the isolationist right tends to have a very particular hostility towards Jews. And then also on the left, you have Code Pink, which even before this, and we already know about their stance with Israel, they were joining with the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene and others in calling for a Ukrainian capitulation of Vladimir Putin. Somebody who oppresses the LGBT community they claim to stand for, and other ethnic and religious minorities within Russia. They were saying that, we need to have a ceasefire and let Putin keep the territories that he already has conquered in Ukraine and things like that. So you have this meeting between these extreme right-wing and extreme left-wing groups. And I don't think that they represent most people in either political party here or in
Oh.
America, but they're very loud. And there are also many in segments of the media, the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC, and also in Fox in regards to the right, who amplify their voices and who drum up these narratives about wanting to have talks and ceasefires, even when polls show that the majority of Americans aren't in favor of that and wish to provide more support, whether it's to Israel or Ukraine or Taiwan down the line.
Or all three, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Seems to be that the people in the center right, center left. I mean, I'm kind of philosophically a conservative, and I want to conserve liberalism and things like gay rights and all of these wonderful achievements that we've advanced with the society, right? It seems that the center kind of supports center left, center right supports Israel and Ukraine. And then you start going further right, and they are still supporting Israel, but not Ukraine. And then you get to the end of the right, and they go full on Palestinian and Russian, right? And the same happens on the left. You go, okay, center left is both. Then the Israel support drops off. The Ukraine continues for a bit, and then that drops off too, and it becomes Russia and Palestine again, right? It's very, very, very strange. I think it's just like, how can I, like, the cognitive dissonance right now, right? So you think about the typical right wing anti-Jewish conspiracy theory is the kind of the view of the Jew as this kind of malevolent but highly intelligent Machiavellian kind of character. I mean, you think of kind of Nazi propaganda posters, you can see exactly what they're trying to get across, right? Puppeting the regimes of Europe and the media from behind the scenes and controlling all these narratives. And you kind of like, and the right kind of have their own kind of version of woke, don't they? Say, the masses aren't aware of it, but we're aware of the Jew and all this kind of stuff. It's like, how can they continue to think that, right? It's one thing thinking that. If the whole of the media was massively pro-Israel and like calling everything out as anti-Semitism, then okay, I mean, maybe you could, it would still be wrong, but maybe you could see it that way. But with the media just being largely one-sided in favor of the Palestinians and not, for example, calling out what seems to be obvious, which is that, the word genocide is used. How can you use the word genocide?
Right.
Israel is going out of its way not to kill civilians, and sure, lots are dying, but the reason that they're dying is because Hamas is martyring them and openly boasting about it. It's not even hidden. You can go on YouTube and find them actually saying it themselves, and yet these weird narratives are popping up anyway.
Yeah. It seems like, words are losing their meaning. I mean, I felt the same way when the Syrian civil war was described as a genocide. And I said, I mean, it's a horrible war. I mean, 500,000 people are dead and it continues, but that's not what genocide means. There's no comparison between that and Rwanda or that and, the Holocaust or any other genocides that have occurred. And similarly here, if Israel had wanted to commit genocide against the Palestinians, it would have been done long ago, and it would already have been done and over with. But
Right.
that's clearly
If
not the case.
if the IDF wanted to genocide the Palestinians, who, let's face it, and Egyptians and Jordanians, really, if we look back,
Yeah.
and then Arabs before that, Israel could do so today, and at the risk of 0 Israeli lives. Right? It could just blow them to high hell, and no Israeli would be endangered then or ever since, right? Or at least not by them, not by the Palestinians. So it's just utterly ludicrous. But I see, this is what one of the ways in which my mind has changed fundamentally from the 7th and before the 7th is I used to think that I could reason with these people. I used to think that I could, here's my position. I'll say it in a inarticulate a way as I can. Here is the evidence to support it. And I used to think that that could persuade people. But I just can't reach them. There's always some kind of special pleading. Like you said, for the Uyghurs. Oh, no, it's not happening. It's just a Western invention. Okay, here's what the IDF have been doing to try to minimize civilians. And here's Hamas openly boasting about them wanting to martyr as many of their own civilians as they can. Oh, no, that's just Western propaganda. It's not. I just don't know how to reach them anymore.
That is how you know that it's anti-Semitism. I mean, first when we had, when October the 7th happened, in the days and first few weeks right after, there were demands from these people on Twitter and elsewhere on social media, show us the videos and the proof and the audio and all, the pictures, everything. As morbid as, to ask to see something like that. I've seen some things and, I will never unsee them. But so then it came out and then they said, well, that's not true. It was, as you said, it was propaganda. So it's like there's no winning. It's just a form of gaslighting, racial gaslighting. Maybe that's a term the woke have not co-opted yet, but that's what it is. And
don't help them.
So that's what we have there. That's how you have all these people asking, how do you know that being opposed to Israel or some form of wording that is anti-Semitic, and that's the easiest way to show it. But I also think that there's not enough realization yet of your feelings, unfortunately, among many Jews, even here in the United States, even in the large Jewish organizations like, the ADL and so on and so forth, who continue to try and reason with people that are unreasonable. It's the same as people who have said, well, we can have a negotiation with Vladimir Putin. Putin is a pathological liar who has said he doesn't want to negotiate. These people have said they don't want to negotiate for peace. They've shown it many times over the decades. At this point, there's nothing to talk about.
We know what a negotiation with Hamas would look like. It would be brokered by Qatar, who are funding, by the way, a lot of the propaganda, the anti-Jewish propaganda, on a scholarly level, as well as China. They're both doing it. So, China may step in or Qatar may step in to try and take all of the brownie points for a negotiated peace treaty, a ceasefire maybe. And it would last for a couple of years, maybe even a decade, during which time Hamas, or if not them, an entity just like them, would rearm, probably along the way firing rockets at Tel Aviv, killing innocent civilians, because nobody talks about the civilians that were killed before the 7th, right, by Hamas, using money that was supposed to be for water pipes and then digging up existing infrastructure to turn it into rockets that astonishing that people miss that point, but we know what that would look like. Same thing in Ukraine. Possibility that Donald Trump gets in. Would he be able to negotiate a peace treaty with Putin? Yeah, absolutely he would. And then there would be peace for about 4 or 5 years until the Russian military could get itself into better shape, and then there would be another invasion. That's what peace looks like. And the other thing that really annoys me is when people say, and this is kind of like an ignorance of what war is as well. So people say, well, look, the Israeli military is much, much stronger than the kind of ragtag bunch of terrorists that Hamas can muster, which is true. So therefore, it's all to do with Israeli complacency, right? It was just that the IDF was being incompetent. And there may be a degree of truth to that as well, in the sense that things could have been done better. But another point that people don't realize is that for the IDF to function at the kind of capacity that it's functioning right now, it depends heavily on reservists.
Mm-hmm.
The professional IDF is very, very good, but it's not that big. And it can't defend the whole of Israel. There are always going to be gaps, and there are always going to be times like Yom Kippur, right? We know from 1973, and that is a time that the Islamists are gonna pick. Although the Egyptians probably weren't Islamists, at least that was a military conflict, right? That's why Egypt doesn't want anything to do with the Palestinians, right? So Israel cannot keep mobilized in the fashion that it is right now forever. Those people have to go back to their jobs. The economy has to go back working. And so Israel has no choice but to go after Hamas. Even in spite of the fact that I think that it's probably well understood in Jerusalem that all of this is going to be a massive propaganda loss for Israel. They don't have a choice. There are always going to be times when a group like Hamas can get through and do something like what they did on the 7th, unless you literally take all of them out.
Right. And, I always tell people that war should, of course, and I would hope most people would agree, be the last resort, but that's because war is ugly. And, a lot of people talk about the military industrial complex and, all that term, sort of connotates. Very few talk about the peace industrial complex and the grave damage that it has done to our world. I mean, with the endless talks that go nowhere, that drag wars and suffering out for years, like the Syrian civil war. How many peace processes and talks have there been to end it? Hasn't ended. People continue to die and homes continue to be destroyed. The peace industrial complex is trying to do the same thing with Ukraine. It's trying to do the same thing here with Israel, to stretch these conflicts out, as it has done really with Israel since its founding, of refusing to acknowledge that there is a side that is unreasonable and you can't negotiate with. It has to be beaten. And so in this kind of war, it's, ideally there would be fewer civilian deaths, some might say, but a victory for Israel means the complete crushing of Hamas, to make an example of them, so that generations from now, not even thinking about the bad attention that Israel's getting from some elements of the press or anything like that, but a propaganda win for Israel would be that generations from now, people will speak of this war and what happened to Gaza the way that even to this day still they talk about the Mongol conquest of Baghdad, as that's something we don't want to mess with and touch. It brought nothing but disaster. We lost everything. And that hopefully that will be enough to not just eliminate the actual radical people, but make people think twice about, do we really want to go down this road?
It's so sad that you're right on that point. We because there are Palestinians on Twitter, for example, who are fully aware of what we're talking about right now, who would like to be out of the West Bank and Gaza and would quite like to live somewhere like the UK or America or maybe even Israel, because they realize what's going on. But aberrations for their context, right? And I mean,
Yeah.
use the word aberrations deliberately because they are viewed as an aberration by their context. The vast majority of people in their context just don't see things like that. And we have to stop thinking that these are people that we can reason with. There may be individual Palestinians that we can reason with, but they're very, very few and far between. They elected Hamas. And, you know, there are some signs that lots of them were discontent with Hamas, but it wasn't about the war or Jew hatred. They were discontent with Hamas because they were maybe incompetent at running certain things on a governmental level, which, by the way, was because they were diverting all their resources towards attacking Israel again. You know, something that has to be inflicted upon them is something that has to be felt down through the generations. They need
Yes.
to feel that God is not on their side.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Yeah.
kind of psychology of person we're talking about. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't like that. If I could wave a magic wand and make them all see reason and rational and all the rest of it, I would do that. So would the vast majority of Israelis, I'm sure. In fact, that's what
Mm-hmm.
Israel did do when they pulled out of Gaza. It's like, okay, let's
Right.
give them their democracy. Let's give them. You talk about a two-state solution. They had their own state, essentially. They had their own
Mm-hmm.
government, utilities. They had everything essentially for a state. It was a state in all but name. And they still did what they did. They have to unfortunately understand that God is not on their side. I mean, and shock on an awful level. I'm afraid I don't see any other alternatives. Otherwise, they will try and do this again and again and again and again, as they say.
Right.
Right? They say that immediately afterwards. They said that we will repeat this again and again, inshallah.
Yeah. Yeah, they did, which is conveniently forgotten by many. And this is there's the talking point in the press, in segments of it, that you can't defeat an ideology, or at least not through only military force.
I think you can.
But if you really, I mean, I don't buy into that. Not only because so many people that believe that way are being killed, but also because, I mean, we look at Japan and Germany crushed. There was nothing there. Occupied, de-radicalized, denazified for generations, to the point where it took a very long time, even after Russia invaded Ukraine, for Germany to agree to send weapons to them, at least of the kind that they needed. A very long time, because they remembered so far back what happened the last time they got engaged in these kind of conflicts. The Japanese, same thing, just now starting to talk about rebuilding their military.
The Japanese have been rebuilding their military quite
Right.
significantly behind the scenes.
Yeah,
If you look at their defense spending as being pretty big, and now, obviously there's a huge hike in
yeah.
defense spending. And by the way, I'm all for it.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Japanese are a really really good example, because the Japanese have maintained their culture, maintained their sense of who they are. And their distinctness from other people, not in a kind of jingoistic way. If anything, actually, the Japanese tend to see themselves as inferior, like, oh, we're really small and weak. And I teach at a Japanese university. I have to kind of remind them that they're not small and weak, and it's actually a very powerful country, culturally, economically, and militarily. But yeah, Japan, the kind of radical worshipping of even the emperor was kept in place, right, after World War II. The kind of radical Shinto, right-wing, quasi-fascist ideology in Japan went, to the extent that today, the Japanese far right, the vast majority of the Japanese far right is pro-American and pro the alliance with America. They don't want to get rid of it. And they're more concerned with places like China, and they tend to be racist towards ethnic Chinese and Koreans, which is, of course, awful.
Right.
But you can see how much Japan has changed. Is that possible in Palestine? Is that possible in Gaza and the West Bank?
I mean, one would like to think so. I think it
Not to
depends
think so.
on. I think it depends on the way that this war ends. At the very least, they need to be made it needs to be made very clear that they're no longer a threat, and that we're not going to bend over for them. It's not just this happened with the, as I said before, the Mongol conquest of Baghdad, but even in
Yeah,
other cases, the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula. The only things that have proven to bring about some sort of peace on a shallow level are, at least in that part of the world, are the loss of territory for a very significant amount of time, and just in warfare. I mean, it's sad and kind of macabre as it is to say, but just enormous amounts of brutality. And so, I mean, I think Israel had made the mistake of ceding land a little bit too soon with
yeah,
Gaza and with portions of Lebanon.
unfortunately.
I think that that will not be happening anytime soon, and also that hopefully Israel has learned now that those are the only two things, if that's going to be what it takes to bring about not as much of a peace, but a surrender. Terms of surrender, and okay, let's at least stop the fighting. We're never going to love each other, but we're not willing to do this anymore. Then I think that there is some hope.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that if there was a surrender, this war would be over tomorrow.
Yes.
If they just turn over the small number of people who were responsible and participated in the actions on the 7th, that would be that, pretty
Mm-hmm.
much. I mean, you may sadly need an occupation of Gaza at this point. I can't see any alternative but an occupation. You can't let that happen again. You can't let people starting to dig terror tunnels underneath hospitals and mosques, so as deliberately to attract fire or have a place where you have impunity to fire rockets from. The one positive I am seeing from the Muslim Middle East is the Saudi Arabian reaction. Have you noticed that?
Yes. So that you're referring to them still being interested in coming to some sort of agreement with Israel,
No,
or
not just that. I mean, yeah, that on the surface, on the one hand, Saudi Arabia is a country that I'm very, 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 very interested in, because Saudi Arabia has deep ties to, traditionally deep ties to the likes of Al Qaeda, and that kind of terror group. But something has changed quite dramatically with the arrival of MBS. So
Mhm.
I follow Saudi Arabian television sometimes because I'm really interested in what happens. And I can't remember his name because I struggle with Arabic names as well. But one of Hamas's leaders was on Saudi state TV, and he was grilled and dragged over the coals by a television presenter who just happened to be a woman. Right.
Oh,
So he
okay. I know it.
really, that was symbolic, right? And none
Yes.
of that is accidental. Saudi Arabia is still an authoritarian dictatorship. So it was a big fuck you, essentially. Sorry, I'm English and we tend to swear a lot. If you've ever seen Gordon Ramsay, you'd know that. It was a big fuck you from essentially from the Saudi Arabian state. And if you look at, there are many. You can't get away with saying stuff that the MBS doesn't like on Saudi Arabian TV. You can't get away with saying stuff that he doesn't like on Twitter, right? You might do if you had like 12 followers or something. But you see something like Saudi Arabian accounts with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of followers, and they are literally going blow by blow. Hamas needs to be eradicated, right? This is a war crime. Like literally would agree with absolutely everything we say and are passionate about it, right? So there are big signs that Saudi Arabia wants done of this. And we know why, right? Because Hamas is, in spite of the fact that it's Sunni, not Shia, it is nevertheless an Iranian proxy. And
Mhm.
those are the two big powers of the region that are going off against each other. But the Palestinian people themselves are Sunni. So is there a chance that once Hamas are eliminated, that the custodian of Mecca and Medina, the kingdom, might step in and fill the void? and try and influence them in a way that is Muslim, but not this kind of Jew-hating madness that we're seeing erupting with them right now? That's my
I
hope.
think there's a I think there's a good chance of that. And one reason also I think that Saudi Arabia is under MBS is quite antagonistic to Hamas, not only about them being supported by Iran, but maybe just as importantly by Qatar and Turkey
Of
with
course.
the Muslim Brotherhood. And I like to think of, speaking of Turkey, of MBS as being sort of like an Arab version of Ataturk.
Yeah,
He's
that's a good comparison.
very
It's
intent on
great.
bringing, yeah,
I
he's
never
very
thought of
intent.
it like that.
He wants to make his country modern and sophisticated, successful beyond oil. He wants all these famous people to come, invest in Saudi Arabia. I've seen even, these ads about the beaches of Jeddah and golf courses and all this kind of stuff. I honestly think for him that the Palestinians are, and he is of a young generation. A lot of people in the West talk about the young generation has moved beyond the Holocaust, and I think to a certain extent he's a good example of a group at the very least of a young generation in the Arab world having moved beyond this cause of Palestine. It doesn't matter to them really very much, if at all. It's quite embarrassing for them, I think. I mean, just the way that they present themselves as begging the world for aid and poor and unsuccessful, having nothing really to offer anybody to the world except for strawberries from Gaza, at least before this war, and this sort of revolutionary third world rhetoric that belongs in the Cold War. So I do think that I think he would see a role for himself and for his media to fill a void in Gaza after the destruction of Hamas and also the other Islamist groups, is saying, see what these extremists from Qatar, Turkey, and Iran, with all of their religious fervor, have brought you: complete destruction, tens of thousands of people dead. Why don't we help bring you towards a different path, make you modern, and have something to offer the world? So I think
Right.
there will be a time where that kind of propaganda, if we want to call it
Well,
that,
that's what it is.
yeah,
Might as well call it what it is.
will filter into there. Also from the UAE, maybe also from Egypt, two other
Yeah.
countries that are trying to move a little bit away from this religious extremism. So I see a role there, if not in the complete reconstruction or rehabilitation, although I think they'll get there as well. I see a role for them to kind of move in and use their soft power to keep things calm and slowly start to change the society.
Is where I think it is headed, and I think that's where the Saudis think it's heading to, and I think that's what they want to do, which is positive. But we've got to get through a hell of a lot right now. Speaking of propaganda, it's so funny because like Israel is so famous at being so good at propaganda, and it absolutely sucks at propaganda. It's so bad. What So if you think about this, I mean, of course, it's incorrect. But again, if we go back to this kind of stereotype about Jewish people, being manipulative and being very competent and clever, but cold. I think people think Jewish people are cold for some reason. I'm trying to kind of figure out how people are thinking about Jews. Israel and unfortunately Jewish people as well, more broadly, have to figure out some way of changing this perception. Have you any idea what can be done in that direction?
Well, yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done, and I write about it a lot in my book as well. But I mean, on a shallow level, Israel needs to get more tourists. It's obviously not now, but at some point into the country, it's extremely expensive to travel to Israel. You look at other neighboring countries nearby, Cyprus and Greece, are much, much more affordable. The bureaucracy of certain things, it's just a huge headache to do that. But Israel has so much to offer. I mean, the great food, amazing beaches and scenery and good weather and all that kind of stuff. But there's not enough of this sort of promotion of that. I think if you just get more people to come and see it for themselves, that would make their job a lot easier. But the other thing is this hasbara, some people call it, which in Hebrew, for anyone who doesn't know, means explanation, basically. Um, and it's just very outdated. And it's not just in Israel, but in the West as well, among the Jewish diaspora. So the talking points for Israel are, if you tend to be a little bit more conservative, or you're sort of like a pro-Israel evangelical, this is the Holy Land and the Bible, said this and that about the Jews being here. And I mean, that's fine and dandy. It might have worked well in the 50s and 60s. It doesn't really hold much water more broadly during this more secular era we're living in. And then on the other side, you have like Israel made the desert bloom and invented the cherry tomato, and Tel Aviv is a gay city and all this kind of stuff. But that's done nothing to quell this campus anti-Semitism we've seen. And then you have, you hear a lot of the talking points about Israel being this settler colonial European country. But who is Israel putting in charge of their, sort of their public facing campaigns? People that look very much like those tropes, even though you have the majority of the population whose family comes from Africa, whether that's Ethiopia or North Africa, or from the Middle East, or even some people who have immigrated from Latin America or India or all these kind of places. You would think that to combat that narrative, these are the people you'd be putting in the forefront, but for whatever reason, it hasn't been done. So there's a huge disconnect on that level. It's quite similar here, even in the Jewish community in the United States, and perhaps other places in the West as well, where with all this DEI talk, you'll have even Jewish day schools doing DEI about other communities and stuff who are not Jewish but are minorities, which is fine and dandy. But at the same time, you have many people even within these communities who don't know that there were Jews from Syria or Jews from Ethiopia, and they don't even know. So where's the Jewish DEI coming from?
Right.
How are we going to implement that? With the Black Lives Matter thing, which a lot of Jews initially supported and started out as a very worthy cause. And, the slogan is, I mean, Black Lives Matter,
Of course I
but,
do.
but the
Except they
organization,
didn't.
right.
Maybe in the 50s,
Yeah. But, the ignoring of, by many progressives, including Black Lives Matter's organization itself, of the Jewish Ethiopians who have been killed on October 7th or in other wars. There's a Jewish Ethiopian held hostage since 2014 in Gaza right now, who's also mentally disabled.
Oh, God.
So there's no talk of that. There's no talk about the way that Black people have been treated in the Arab world throughout history. But you have this BLM for Palestine. I mean, it's ludicrous, and so this whole DEI thing going on in the Jewish community and the diaspora is also very shallow and is not helping really any Israel advocacy. But also, so there's like this gap between Israel and in the diaspora, and then there's all of these issues within that makes it very hard to create a coherent way of combating all of this.
Mm.
And unfortunately, you also have these camps from within each side fighting amongst each other about how are we going to present ourselves to the world. And then they're so consumed by their fighting that gives more time for anti-Semites to continue their own campaign.
It's very funny. I mean, I remember as somebody in their late in my early 20s, I remember thinking, anti-Semitism, really? Is it really a thing? Like it couldn't, like I couldn't tell who was Jewish or not, right? I have no idea. Um, and and so I just thought, like, it just struck me as so irrational that, like, nobody could think like that. Really? Come on. Maybe a couple of nutters, okay. Some idiot who still thinks Hitler was a good guy. But basically that was it. Some fringe weirdos. But it's just everywhere now. It's absolutely shocking. Yeah, I mean, propaganda is really what you need, I think. I think it needs to be. I think that here's that guy. He's an IDF spokesman. I feel really bad for him. It seems like a really nice guy. He often hosts these videos where he's showing you this is what happened here and this is what happened here. Jonathan something or other. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, seems like a good bloke. But I feel really bad for him because there he is. He's honestly trying his best to show you this happened here, this happened here, this happened here. Here are the, assault rifles, the AK-47s. Here are the explosives. Here are the vests. Here is everything. Evidence, reasonable arguments, backed with evidence. But nobody cares. They just say it's propaganda. So there needs to be some kind of way of speaking to the heart, bypassing the brain, I think, and coming up with arguments or soft power that might win people over. And I think we can look at Japan as a good example of a way that Israel might go. So if you think about the world's perception of Japan, even 40 years ago, lots of people had a very, 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 very negative perception of Japan because of the horrible things that Japan did in World War II. Now, obviously, the Japanese people of 40 years ago were not responsible for that. And so it was terrible to think that way towards Japanese people. But nevertheless, people did, right? So you have to, unfortunately, deal with reality as it is rather than as it ought to be, right? Because, of course, Jewish people should not have to defend themselves against this nonsense. But there has to be some way of changing the narrative. And so what Japan did very, very well is start to branch out in entertainment. So manga, video games, and that slowly changed people's perceptions. Even within places like South Korea, for example, which even recently there was quite a bit bitter enmity. But the young people are starting to kind of align, which is great. Is there any sign of that happening in Israel?
I think Israel has taken perhaps some level of inspiration from that, but on a smaller or like a more technical, literally, side. So a lot of people also, of course, think about South Korea or Japan or Taiwan even as, these high-tech kind of societies, and Israel has been doing similar things with, the Silicon Wadi, the startup nation, that whole aspect of stuff. I think on a smaller level culturally, with Eurovision, was it 5 or 6 years ago now, that song Toy that won. And, I was in Cyprus at the time, and even everybody there was like, oh, this song is so great. It's even better than our own. And I was like, well, I actually disagree with you. I like your song better. But at the time. But, it's punching above its weight in Eurovision. I think that we were getting to a place there where there were more tourists coming, before the pandemic, and obviously before this war. There were record numbers of tourists coming each year. There were ads. I saw them, on the TV here for Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and coming to visit and stuff like that. So I think that it's trying. I think it'll get there. This might be a little bit of a setback for some time. But, I think that it is moving in the right direction. There's certain hurdles that need to be overcome that might take maybe 10 or 15 years, even before the war, with, the aftershocks of the pandemic and everything that was going on there was one thing. And another thing has been this political argument over Netanyahu and the judicial reform and all of that. So there's some things internally that need to be solved first, I think, before we can kind of push forward. That being said, though, I have hope. I think things are going the right direction.
So let's kind of close on the situation now. Israel closing in on Rafah. What do you think is going to come next? How long do you think this is going to drag out for?
I do think that at a certain point, the military is going to have to act there. I don't see Hamas, for them, it would be a surrender if there was some kind of ceasefire, even a pause, to hand back some of the hostages. I think the government has made very clear in Israel that they're not going to be moving toward a two-state solution. They're going to continue the war. There will be no full ceasefire. They're not going to release all of these terrorist prisoners that Hamas wants. I think there will be some efforts at talking more, letting in some aid, trying to get civilians out. But I do think that at some point the military will act in Rafah.
Yeah, I think they have to. I'm, you know, death is horrible, war is horrible. There are tragedies, but as I think you make the case very well, that unfortunately, if we were to press ahead with peace, we may save a lot of lives in the short run, but the suffering in the long term would be much worse. The consequences would be much worse. So I've been, Israel is being put under tremendous pressure right now, including from the United States, many countries, to put an end to this war. And I really hope, for the best interest of the Palestinians as well, by the way, for the best interest of literally anybody who has an Islamic jihadi, this has to be seen through to its conclusion. Do you think the political will is there in Israel to do that?
Yes, I think that even something else that hasn't been taken into account with how deeply this has changed the country was what places in particular were attacked. I lived in a kibbutz, very, overlooking what was once the Gazan town of Beit Hanun and is no longer. But a lot of the people, not just on my kibbutz, but in the surrounding ones that were attacked, and mine was, thank God, mostly spared, were very left-leaning, hated Netanyahu, really wanted peace, drove sick and injured children from the crossings by Gaza. They themselves drove them to Israeli hospitals to be treated. Some of the people who were killed and kidnapped were conscientious objectors to the army because they didn't want to be involved in the conflict. There was a very famous Canadian immigrant named Vivian Silver who was murdered. They didn't know where she was for many weeks and then identified her remains. And she was always working with these peace marches with Palestinian women and other very left-leaning Israeli women as well, and some men. The fact that those places were not just attacked or shot with rockets or anything, which had happened previously in other conflicts in Gaza, but the nature of the attack, the brutality of it, how personal it was in terms of what was done. There is no big segment left, not that there necessarily was before this, but there is no big segment left in Israel of society, even among the left, that is willing to, at any point in the foreseeable future, give peace a chance the way that the West wanted to in the Oslo era. Gazan workers were brought in to work these avocado orchards and farms and things like that in these kibbutzim, and ended up either partaking in the atrocities or they had been gathering intelligence on where people lived and giving it Hamas and others the entire time. There's no appetite for any of that. And I think that there are not many people among the broad Israeli populace and even in the government, especially in the nature of this government, who really give much of a damn of what the West thinks. They want this to be finished and seen through. And there's the thought that, if Israel already has taken this much flack for what it's done, you might as well finish the job.
Sod it in a way. Like, you know, the world hates Israel, unfortunately. And so, you know, propaganda losses are not counting for much. If they hate you anyway, you might as well do what, you're not going to win on that level. You can win the war. But as things are, you are not going to win the propaganda victory, not over this war. You may do 10 years down the line, if something's done about the soft power angle that we're both talking about. But for the foreseeable future, no. I mean, just completely disregard that and plug on with the war. I completely agree. And one of the messages that needs to get out after this conflict really is that, as an English person growing up, right, in the UK, in the 80s and 90s, my whole identity, my whole sense of who I was of somebody who came from a culture that saw what the Nazis were doing and stood up to it, right, and said, no, we're not going to have this. And Britain attacked them. It wasn't the other way around. Hitler wanted no part of a war with the UK because he had been through one in World War One, and he thought that the UK was a kind of Germanic empire and we can be brothers and the rest of it. But that was it. That was something that I felt as a part of me. When I'm painting my Spitfire Airfix models and stuff. Seriously, I mean, it's those kind of romantic notions, silly as it may seem, that form this kind of not necessarily rational, but this kind of narrative of who you are as an individual. And standing up against Nazis really was something that I believed in. And I find it really weird that people are calling me a Nazi now for continuing to stand up for Jews. Anyway, but if we think about, the extent to which the West continues, because the word Nazi is bandied about all of the time, continues to identify as being against fascism and Nazism because of the horrors of World War II, including the Holocaust, especially the Holocaust. It's worth pointing out that in many ways, what happened on the 7th was arguably worse than the Holocaust. Now, don't get me wrong, the industrial scale of the killing on the Holocaust was obviously much, 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 much worse. But the level of evil was of a different order. So the Nazis could achieve a much greater killing because they had a military and a whole industrial complex that was capable of doing it, right? But a lot of the time, these concentration camp guards or these people, the way in which they killed them was a very kind of, you're going into the showers and we're going to gas you. It was, get it over and done with in an industrial way. There wasn't this kind of sadism, right? A lot of the time in World War II, Nazis would go out and get really drunk after doing horrible things to Jewish people because they knew what they were doing. They might have justified it to themselves on a rational level by means of their warped ideology. But on some level, at least they knew what they were doing was wrong, right? There's evidence of that. And yet what we saw from the 7th, there was none of that. Like, these people had dehumanized their victims to such an extent that, not only were they brutally and sadistically raping children, they were and decapitating old people and killing people. They were then jubilantly phoning their relatives. Oh, father, get your mother on the phone. Oh, all that kind of stuff. This jubilant. I've never seen anything like that. That kind of evil is on a level I've never seen.
Yeah. This was more this was more of an older kind of evil of the nature of, the pogroms of the Russian Empire,
Yeah.
or the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians, the Greeks, the Assyrian, all those Christian minorities. The way it was carried out was much more, very almost identical to the same kind of things that were done to those groups in, over 100 years ago. The nature of the crime, how personal and close it was, and the high that these people seem to get off of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
I think that, the West has sort of lost its way in some aspects. I mean,
Some?
with
One or
with
two?
it's forgotten what it means to have something worth fighting for, and that
Yeah.
there's some things that are wrong, and that need to be, that only force can really solve. It was the same thing with what the Russian army did in places like Bucha or Irpin in Ukraine. It's the same kind of evil, and the way that you saw, speaking of, and how these conflicts connect, the crowd in Russia that stormed that airport,
Oh, yeah.
hunting for Jews, hunting for Israelis, the propaganda that Putin has parroted out regarding Israel's war crimes in Gaza, as if he committed none. Um, and the fact that this was carried out on his birthday as well.
Mm.
So the West needs to, I think we need a new generation of leaders, and they need to come from different backgrounds. People who have studied these kinds of things, not just those who went to the very schools where you see this sharp rise in anti-Semitism, and who make excuses for all kinds of moral ills, and who are always trying to talk a way out of a conflict with people that you can't reason with. Because really, if you think about this is beyond just Israel or
Oh, yeah.
Ukraine, or hopefully we can avoid that with Taiwan too. But it's a war for civilization as a whole. These kinds of things don't have any place in our world. That kind of ideology cannot coexist with where the world is and where it wants to be going.
I
And
also
so, oh, go ahead.
And I also think that people need to understand that, it's not just the anti-Semitism of, the scholarly anti-Semitism that you refer to with kids on campus who would probably be happy to embrace a Jewish person if that Jewish person was coming out with the same rhetoric as them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's bad enough, don't get me wrong, but it's not just that. The problem is much, much, much worse than that. The kind of anti-Semitism that we see from Hamas is also with us within London, right? We've seen it in London. We've seen it in New York. Now, these people might not be doing stuff that Hamas have done because they know what the consequences would be if they did, but they feel it in their hearts. And they've been with us for quite some time as well. And now hopefully people are beginning to see it. I'll tell you a story of a friend of mine, which was really interesting. So back in the 80s, he's a bit older than me. Back in the 80s, he had a Syrian girlfriend, and her parents were moderate Muslims. Like there are moderate Jews right now who maybe don't often go to the synagogue or once a year, and it's all symbolic. But they like the custom and the tradition. And so he was fine. He was welcome round to the house, and he got on really well with them. There was no problems, but there was one rule. He was never to be allowed upstairs. That was the one rule. And so they dated for a couple of years, and classic kind of Garden of Eden kind of type story, right? The forbidden fruit. And he was like, everybody was out. He was in the house on their own, and he thought, okay, I'm going to have to go and peek and see what's happening upstairs. And by the way, this was a family that would frequent Jewish businesses and speak to people, that was actually in Hollywood, in Los Angeles. So he goes upstairs to this room, opens the door, and looks in. And can you guess what he sees? An altar to Hitler. a huge
Oh my
picture
God.
of Hitler. And this was a family that had, interactions with Jewish people. It was unbelievable. And so he then confronts his girlfriend about this. And he's, what the fuck is that? And her response is, yeah, look, I know it might strike you as a little bit weird and the rest of it, but it is what it is. And it's really common for us. Lots of families have this in their house. And, that for him then was a big wake up call of just how visceral and embedded this vile anti-Semitism. And again, that's not the kind of anti-Semitism that you see on campuses. It's an order worse than that. But that anti-Semitism is here, and it's been here for a long time. And I just hope that people can wake up to it.
Yeah. I think, something that gives me hope is in the 30s, even here in America and in some other places as well, there were crowds of people, marches in favor of Hitler and Nazis and wanting, if not an alliance with Hitler, then to adopt many of the same policies he had. And after he was destroyed, after Germany was destroyed and divvied up and occupied, those crowds became very difficult to find. So I'm hoping that, which is another reason I'm very much in favor of seeing this war through to the end, that there will be something similar that will come out, that, nobody wants to support the losing side. And if it's made very clear that there's no massive catastrophic defeat for not just for Hamas, but for Iran, for, abroad, even for Putin, if there's a catastrophic defeat for them, I have good, not that all of this, not all, that all these people or all this ideology will go away, but that a significant amount of people will kind of wake up and see that there's no future for any of this.
No, but I worry that, I stopped caring about it. Like, again, I tried to reason with people, and now, like, I used to care about their opinion of me, and now I don't give a shit. I'm just like, you haven't woken up after the 7th, then whatever. You can call me a racist as much as you like. I really don't care. Well, that's what they do, right? If they haven't woken up after the 7th, then what's it going to take? And I worry. I genuinely think that a significant terrorist attack on the scale of something like 9/11, may happen soon, and that may be what it takes for these people to wake up.
Gosh, yeah, let's hope not.
No, let's hope not. But thinking about it, like, some of these Muslim terrorists might think, well, if they didn't wake up after the 7th, maybe we can get away with something in America now that we couldn't get away with in 2001, right? Maybe if we do that in America now, everybody will blame America instead of us because things have changed. It's a very strange world that we're living in right now. But yes, let's end it on a positive note. Let's hope that we can see this war out as soon as possible, and that people begin to start waking up to the threat that anti-Semitism poses, not just to the Jewish people, but to the whole of us, because it represents a hatred, yes, of Jews first, but the rest of us too. Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.